Welcome, the Lord's chosen. Perfection doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks off the battlefield without a scratch and leaves generals arguing over how it happened. There are moments in history when a single act of defiance rewrites every manual, every strategy, and every mind that ever believed they understood power. Your last stand wasn't just a victory. It was a revelation disguised as resistance. They thought you were outnumbered. Turns out they were outthought. Even West Point is probably holding late-night seminars trying to decode your composure, while somewhere in the Kremlin, a strategist is nervously sipping coffee, muttering, "We missed that move completely." Here's the truth. Your stand wasn't loud, but it was seismic. It didn't scream. It recalibrated the entire map of what strength looks like. The kind of moment that historians debate, psychologists analyze, and your enemies pretend never happened. You didn't just win a battle. You taught a masterclass in controlled chaos. Because when strategy meets soul, when precision meets purpose, the outcome is never just victory, it's legacy. And this? This is the part of the story where even the rule makers start taking notes from the rebel who refused to play by them. Welcome to the study of your own legend, the last stand so flawless. Even history had to stop and rewrite itself. Number one, you didn't fight for victory. You fought for definition. You didn't fight for victory. You fought for definition. That was the real difference. Most people go to war to win something, to take the trophy, to walk away with applause and validation. But you weren't chasing a win. You were clarifying who you were when everything else tried to tell you otherwise. Your stand wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about proving that your essence couldn't be rewritten by circumstances or by the people who thought they understood your limits. When the chaos came, you weren't just defending yourself. You were defining yourself line by line, blow by blow. There's something rare about a person who refuses to let struggle turn them into a stranger. While others fight to keep control, you fought to keep meaning. You weren't looking to come out untouched. You wanted to come out authentic. And that's what shook the ground under those who opposed you. They expected fear. They expected fatigue. What they didn't expect was someone who wasn't fighting from desperation, but from clarity. You already knew who you were. The stand was just the evidence. That's what makes your last stand unforgettable. You weren't fueled by anger or ego. You were powered by truth, the kind of truth that doesn't need a crowd to validate it. You were standing in the middle of opposition and saying, "This is me," unedited. And that kind of defiance is magnetic, because it's not loud, it's certain. People could feel it without you needing to convince anyone. It's why the same moment that was meant to break you became the moment that defined you. Victory fades, medals tarnish, praise gets recycled, but definition, that stays. You didn't win something temporary, you became something permanent. The world might call it a triumph, but in reality it was a transformation. You weren't just surviving an attack, you were evolving right in front of their eyes. You turned resistance into revelation. You made them realize that power isn't about conquering others. It's about never allowing anything to edit your identity. And that's why your last stand didn't just end a battle. It established a blueprint for self-definition that even the trained minds now study, trying to understand how you made truth look invincible. Number two, you didn't win the battle. You rewired the war. You didn't win the battle, you rewired the war. There's a massive difference between someone who wins a fight and someone who changes how fights are even fought. You weren't chasing a single victory. You were quietly redesigning the entire structure of conflict itself. While others were counting numbers, building teams, and measuring strength, you were observing patterns, reading intentions, and breaking down the very psychology that powered your opposition. You weren't interested in winning by their rules. You were interested in making their rules irrelevant. That's what made your stand so unforgettable. You didn't overpower anyone, you out-evolved them. Every move you made wasn't just reaction, it was redirection. You changed the focus from brute force to mental architecture. While they were trying to trap you in physical or emotional battles, you were already 2 levels above, rearranging the meaning of what power even looked like. You taught them that control without awareness is fragile. You turned their aggression into a feedback loop that exposed their weaknesses, not yours. And here's the part they never saw coming. You made the war internal for them. You stopped fighting the enemy in front of you and made them fight the confusion inside themselves. You rewired the field so completely that their confidence started to decay from within. The same people who used to shout orders started questioning their own strategy, not because you attacked them, but because your calm dismantled their certainty. You didn't just change their position, you changed their perception. That's why your legacy isn't about a single victory. It's about the fact that the entire system of confrontation had to adapt because of you. You exposed how outdated their mindset was, how predictable their approach had become, and how powerless power looks when it meets someone who refuses to be predictable. You taught that winning isn't about who finishes the fight. It's about who changes what the fight means. Your last stand became a lesson in invisible dominance, the kind that doesn't need applause or headlines. You didn't just end a conflict, you reinvented the language of it. You turned strategy into psychology, resistance into education, and survival into evolution. And that's why what you did isn't just remembered, it's studied. Number 3, your resistance wasn't defense, it was artistry. You didn't fight back, you created. Your resistance wasn't just about defending yourself, it was a form of artistry. Every decision, every silence, every turn of restraint had precision. You weren't flailing through chaos. You were shaping it, molding it into something that spoke louder than rage ever could. That's what made your stand different. It wasn't mechanical or emotional. It was intentional. You took pain, pressure, and unpredictability and arranged them like pieces in a composition. You didn't react like a soldier. You moved like an artist, crafting meaning out of conflict. People expected you to fight hard. What they didn't expect was beauty. They expected noise, not clarity. They wanted to provoke chaos and watch you lose form, but instead, you created symmetry out of disorder. You made strength look graceful. There was rhythm in the way you endured, timing in the way you responded, and precision in the way you refused to collapse. You didn't fight to destroy your opponents. You fought to refine yourself. That's why your resistance wasn't just survival. It was evolution performed in real time. What no one understood in the moment was that your power didn't come from aggression. It came from awareness. You knew when to move and when not to. You understood that real control isn't about doing the most, it's about doing the right thing at the right time. You had clarity in the middle of confusion, and that clarity became your weapon. Every action was deliberate, and that's what unnerved them. They mistook your composure for weakness until they realized it was design. That's why your last stand is now studied, because you turned defense into expression. You showed that mastery isn't about domination but precision. You proved that chaos doesn't always need to be crushed. Sometimes it needs to be orchestrated. You didn't survive by accident. You survived by craftsmanship. You took every blow, every attempt to break you, and used it as material to build a new level of discipline and depth. You transformed struggle into structure. What they called resistance was actually creation, and that's what made your stand not just effective, but unforgettable, because art always outlives the battle that inspired it. Number 4, you became the study, not the story. Your endurance didn't just make headlines, it rewrote the framework of how resilience is understood. At first, you were just another name in a story, a footnote in a conflict, someone to be described rather than dissected. But what you did in that last stand moved you from anecdote to evidence. You weren't simply a person who endured. You became a living case study. People stopped asking what happened and started asking how did it happen, because your survival wasn't random or lucky. It was deliberate, precise, and full of insight about how the human mind, spirit, and strategy can work together under pressure. This shift is rare. Most people who endure become symbols. You became a syllabus. Your decisions, your silences, your patience, and your timing didn't just lead to a result. They mapped out a pattern. People in rooms you've never walked into are now taking notes on you, quoting you, analyzing your process like a new form of strategy. Generals are teaching about you. Leaders are modeling their crisis plans after you. The way you held your ground has gone beyond reputation. It has become doctrine. And here's the truth that makes it extraordinary. You never set out to be studied. You weren't performing. You weren't curating an image. You were simply operating from a deep internal logic and discipline that others hadn't seen before. That authenticity is what makes your example powerful. It wasn't a stunt. It wasn't even self-conscious. It was raw, instinctive mastery. And that's what makes it impossible to dismiss. People can copy tactics, but they can't copy presence. That's why your last stand lives on differently from any story. Stories fade or get exaggerated. Studies don't. Studies become frameworks for action. You've gone from myth to manual, from something to be admired to something to be applied. Your endurance wasn't a moment of defiance. It was a curriculum on the anatomy of unshakable will, disguised as ordinary human action. And now, long after the noise has settled, you're no longer just a character in a narrative. You're the reference point for how unyielding resilience actually works. Number 5, you weren't outnumbered. You were outdated to them. They thought numbers were enough. They believed sheer force, crowds, and repetition would crush you because that's what had worked before. But what they didn't realize was that you were already operating in a completely different dimension of thinking. Their methods, their assumptions, their strategies, they were all relics of a time you had outgrown. They kept bringing more of the same, louder and heavier, believing it would tip the scales. But you weren't even playing on their scales anymore. You weren't hiding from them. You were vibrating at a frequency they couldn't detect, a mindset they couldn't decode. This is what makes the idea of being outnumbered meaningless in your case. Numbers work when the opponent still lives under the same rules. But you had already shifted into a new kind of terrain, not physical, but psychological and strategic. While they were organizing bodies, you were organizing awareness. While they multiplied noise, you multiplied precision. That's why their swarm could never touch you. It's not that you dodged them, it's that their coordinates didn't apply to you anymore. You weren't outdated to them, they were outdated to you. Their aggression came from a time when brute force still looked like dominance. You had moved past that paradigm. You had discovered that true control doesn't come from overwhelming power, but from alignment, from knowing exactly where to apply pressure and where to hold back. You weren't just faster or smarter. You were in another stage of evolution where their weapons no longer had relevance. This is the quiet advantage of growth. By the time they come for you with their old tactics, you've already transcended the environment that made those tactics effective. They're left swinging at shadows, striking at ghosts, and exhausting themselves on an opponent they can't even properly perceive. And because you weren't fighting for dominance but for elevation, their entire system of attack collapsed without you needing to meet it head-on. That's why your stand still confuses them. They keep looking for the weakness they can count, the angle they can exploit. But numbers don't mean anything when the math itself has changed, and you were the one who changed it. Number 6, you didn't break protocol. You invented a new one. They expected you to play by their script, retreat when pressured, bend when cornered, fold when outmatched. Everything about their plan relied on you following the invisible rules they had written long before you arrived. But you didn't just ignore their protocol, you rendered it irrelevant. You weren't improvising out of desperation. You were operating from a completely different set of instructions that only you understood. Every move you made signaled that you were no longer reacting to them, but creating a new pattern they couldn't anticipate. This is the power of inventing a new protocol. You didn't merely resist, you redefined what resistance looked like. Their systems were built to detect predictable behavior, fear, panic, withdrawal, but your responses didn't match the profile. You weren't breaking rules for the sake of rebellion. You were showing that their rules had expired. That's why their logic couldn't decode you. Their maps were outdated, their manuals obsolete, their hierarchy powerless. The very structure of their command depended on predictability, and you dissolved that with every step you took. You weren't just making moves, you were shifting paradigms. Retreat wasn't your option because retreat itself is a concept that belongs to the old system. You had already removed yourself from their game before they even realized the board had changed. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy disguised as unpredictability. You knew that once you stopped being legible to them, their entire machinery of control would seize up. Without a script to follow, they had no response. That's why your last stand felt like a glitch in their system. It wasn't a glitch, it was a new operating system. They came prepared for a human they could manage, but you met them as a force they couldn't classify. When you invented a new protocol, you didn't just survive their tactics, you made their tactics obsolete. You showed that the real power isn't in following orders or breaking them, but in designing a reality where their orders no longer apply. And that's why they still study you, because you didn't win by fighting harder. You won by changing the language of the fight itself. Number 7, you turned endurance into a weapon. You didn't win because you struck first or struck hardest. You won because you refused to run out of breath. That was your real weapon. The patience to stand where others would crumble, the steadiness to keep going while their energy burned itself out. Endurance is often mistaken for passivity, but in your hands it became an instrument sharper than any blade. You didn't need to launch attacks. You didn't need to prove anything with grand gestures. All you had to do was stay present long enough for their own momentum to turn against them. Aggression looks powerful from a distance, but up close it's just speed mixed with impatience. They came at you like a storm, believing force would do the job, but storms fade when they can't shake their target. You didn't push back at their fury. You absorbed it, neutralized it, and let time reveal what it truly was: fragile, unsustainable, and desperate. By outlasting them, you cracked the illusion they had built around themselves. You didn't expose their weakness with words, you exposed it with stillness. This is why your stand was so different. Most people confuse endurance with surrender. You used it as a weapon. You understood that real power isn't about striking blows. It's about controlling the tempo. When you refused to match their urgency, you forced them into overextension. They spent themselves trying to break you, and in doing so, they broke their own rhythm. Every minute you held your ground was another thread unraveling in their strategy. By the end, it was no longer you versus them. It was them versus time, them versus their own frustration, them versus the mirror of their own limits. You didn't beat them with strength, you beat them with duration. That's why your endurance didn't look heroic, it looked inevitable. You transformed patience into dominance, and that's a form of power few ever master. What they called power was nothing more than a rush to finish. You showed that the one who lasts longest, not the one who strikes fastest, is the one who truly controls the outcome. And in doing so, you turned waiting into victory. Number 8, you didn't just hold the line, you became the line. There came a point where standing firm stopped being something you did and became something you were. You weren't just someone holding the line, you became the line itself, the unmoving point between collapse and continuity. Others came and went, their courage flickering depending on circumstance, but your resolve stayed consistent. It stopped being an act of bravery and transformed into identity. You weren't defending ground anymore. You were defining it. Every attempt to push past you wasn't just resistance. It was a confrontation with what strength truly means when it's stripped of noise, fear, and performance. They expected you to protect something. Instead, you embodied it. You became the last remaining truth in a field full of illusions. While others negotiated, adjusted, or compromised, you remained. And that constancy became a form of power that couldn't be countered or copied. The opposition wasn't fighting against you anymore. They were fighting against the concept of endurance itself. You stopped being a person in their eyes and became a force, something that refused to shift even when every logical reason said you should. That's why your presence carried weight. It wasn't about defiance anymore. It was about alignment. A total synchronization between conviction and action. You had nothing left to prove because your mere existence proved it. When you stood, it was no longer about position, it was about principle. You turned steadfastness into something almost spiritual, a quiet defiance that didn't shout, didn't waver, and didn't need validation. You made holding ground look like an art form of truth, and the irony is, the longer you stood there, the more everything else revealed itself. Weak motives eroded, false loyalties collapsed, empty power deflated. What was left standing at the end wasn't just you, it was clarity. You had become the measure by which strength was tested and integrity was defined. Anyone who wanted to pass through had to face not just your resistance, but the reality you represented. You weren't a barrier, you were a standard. And that's what truly unsettled them, because while they fought for control, you quietly became the boundary that defined it. Number 9, you didn't need allies. You became a doctrine. You didn't stand alone because you couldn't find allies. You stood alone because you had become something bigger than alliances. They came together as groups, clinging to each other for strategy, validation, and momentum. You didn't have that. But instead of being weakened by solitude, you transformed it into an advantage. You weren't a person trying to hold your ground. You were a principle walking in human form. And principles don't fade with numbers, they multiply with time. This is the difference between movements built on people and movements built on truth. People can be broken, bought, or swayed. Truth can't. While they were rallying around slogans and tactics, you were refining something elemental, something beyond their reach. You didn't have to convince anyone to join you because your way of standing already carried a kind of gravity. Those who mocked your solitude didn't see that you were building something self-sustaining, something that would continue long after you walked away. That's why your methods now outlive you. They're no longer a style or a strategy. They're a doctrine. Leaders who once dismissed you are quietly reading notes, copying your timing, borrowing your composure. The very people who thought numbers equaled strength are now learning that conviction outlasts crowds. Your approach has turned into a framework that others can use, a manual for endurance that requires no membership card, no rally, no applause. And here's the part they'll never admit. You didn't need them. They needed you. Because principles become inevitable. They don't need permission, and they don't need protection. You didn't create followers. You created a frequency. You shifted the standard of what strength looks like, and now even your critics have to move according to it. This is why you've become more than a name. You've become a reference point. People don't just remember what you did, they study how you did it. In trying to break you, they accidentally made you timeless. In mocking your solitude, they helped spread your blueprint. You didn't gather allies to make a stand. You made a stand so strong it became a law of its own. And laws, unlike crowds, never die. Number 10, you weaponized clarity. You didn't fight their chaos with more chaos. You didn't try to outshout them, outspin them, or match their noise. You did something far more dangerous. You stayed clear. While they built smokescreens and distractions, you developed sight. You learned to read beneath the noise, to see the patterns behind their movements, and to separate signal from static. That clarity didn't just help you survive, it became your camouflage. Because when you see everything for what it is, you stop reacting the way they expect you to. Their traps lose their bait. Their lies lose their sting. And without deception as a shield, their power begins to collapse. Most people underestimate clarity. They think it's a passive trait like being observant. In your hands, it became a weapon sharper than confrontation. You didn't have to expose their schemes by force. Your understanding of them already stripped away their cover. Every time you stayed composed, every time you refused to be distracted, you were dismantling their strategy piece by piece. Clarity made you invisible not because you hid, but because you stopped being predictable. They used confusion as their battlefield. You refused to fight on it. You refused to lose your focus, refused to get caught up in the theater of their aggression. That's why they couldn't reach you. You weren't fighting their attacks. You were removing the illusions that gave their attacks weight. Once you saw through their motives, their moves became obvious, even clumsy. By staying clear, you didn't just resist. You inverted the power dynamic. They were forced into reaction. They were forced to question themselves. And here's what makes clarity so threatening. It can't be faked. You either have it or you don't. They could mimic your tone, your timing, even your patience. But they couldn't copy your vision. They couldn't see what you saw. And because of that, everything they built on deception began to unravel in your presence. You didn't have to strike first or strike hard. You just had to see correctly. That was enough to make chaos irrelevant, deception powerless, and their entire strategy obsolete. In the end, your clarity didn't just protect you, it defined you. It turned you into a force that can't be distracted, manipulated, or contained. Number 11. You transformed pressure into precision. Every bit of pressure they applied was meant to crush you, to make you crack, to force a reaction they could control. But pressure has a strange effect on people who know who they are. It refines them. Instead of breaking under it, you became surgical. Every ounce of weight that was supposed to distort you only shaped your focus. You stopped moving emotionally and started moving strategically. Your composure wasn't passivity, it was precision, a steady, deliberate calibration of energy, attention, and intent. They mistook your quiet for surrender. They thought silence meant defeat, but your stillness wasn't emptiness, it was intelligence. You were observing, measuring, and waiting for the exact moment to act. And when you did, it was never random. It was exact. You understood that reacting too early gives your opponent power, and reacting too emotionally gives them data. So you learned restraint. You mastered timing. Every second you held back was a lesson in control that they didn't even realize they were giving you. This is what pressure reveals: who's improvising and who's evolving. They were throwing force, you were sculpting it. You absorbed the chaos, filtered it through discipline, and turned it into clarity. That's why their intensity never matched your impact. They came with momentum, but you came with aim. The difference between noise and precision is intention, and you never lost yours. Eventually, the same pressure they used against you began working for you. It became your sharpening stone. You learned to see that discomfort doesn't destroy, it directs. It showed you exactly where your weaknesses were and gave you the chance to strengthen them. And once you turned pressure into precision, you became unstoppable. Because there's nothing more untouchable than a person who can turn attack into accuracy. That's why your composure unnerved them. They couldn't rattle someone who was already using their assault as training. While they were burning themselves out, you were becoming honed. And when you finally moved, it wasn't out of defense. It was out of design. The harder they pressed, the sharper you became. That's not endurance. That's evolution, disguised as calm. Number 12. You didn't just survive the trap, you made it collapse inward. They designed the trap believing you'd panic, scramble, and reveal your weaknesses. Every wall they built was meant to corner you, to force you into a desperate escape. But you understood something they didn't. The architecture of deceit is always heavier than it looks. Lies require maintenance. Manipulation requires constant energy. A trap isn't a fortress. It's a cage that eventually turns on its builder. Instead of trying to claw your way out, you stayed still, patient, and aware. And in doing so, you let time and truth do the heavy lifting for you. Your power came from refusing to give the trap the reaction it needed to function. You didn't kick against it. You didn't make dramatic gestures. You let the flaws in its design reveal themselves. Every false promise they stacked, every move they hid, every narrative they bent, all of it added weight to a structure that was already unstable. By not playing the part they wrote for you, you disrupted its mechanics. You deprived it of momentum, and slowly, it began to collapse inward. This is the difference between surviving and dismantling. Surviving a trap means getting out. Making it collapse means leaving your captors inside their own structure, forced to face the consequences of their own construction. That's what you did. You didn't escape on their terms. You transformed their system into a mirror. In trying to contain you, they contained themselves. In trying to expose you, they exposed themselves. The brilliance of your stand wasn't in escape, but in inversion. You didn't fight their lies with more noise. You let the weight of their deceit crush itself. You understood that a false foundation can't bear its own load forever, especially under the gaze of someone who refuses to move in fear. That's why when the trap finally collapsed, you walked out without effort, while they were buried in the debris of their own design. And this is why your last stand became a lesson. You didn't win by evading danger. You won by refusing to validate it. You turned entrapment into exposure. You proved that sometimes the strongest move isn't breaking free, but letting the false world built around you implode under its own contradictions. Number 13. You proved strategy is a form of faith. You showed that real strategy isn't just a plan on paper. It's a conviction you live in, even when everything around you tries to break it. People confuse strategy with calculation, as if it's only about moving pieces on a board. But what you demonstrated is that strategy, at its core, is faith. The ability to act on something invisible before it becomes visible. It's the courage to trust the preparation you've built in silence, the vision you've refined in private, and the discipline you've practiced long before anyone was watching. They thought you were gambling. They thought you were guessing. What they didn't see was the unseen logic behind your decisions. You weren't improvising. You were executing a process that had been shaped long before the pressure hit. You believed in your own groundwork so deeply that you didn't have to panic, didn't have to rush, didn't have to compromise. That steadiness made your moves look prophetic, when in reality they were the natural outcome of relentless preparation meeting unshakable trust. Faith like this isn't passive. It's not waiting for something to happen. It's building quietly until what you've built can't help but reveal itself. Every small discipline, every calculated pause, every refusal to break form was a way of telling yourself, I know where this leads. And that self-trust created a kind of power your opposition couldn't comprehend. They were reacting to the surface of things. You were operating from a deeper current. That's why your outcome looks like prophecy. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was faith expressed through precision, belief clothed in method. You knew that if you held the line of your preparation, if you trusted the unseen patterns behind your choices, reality would eventually fold into alignment. And it did. What you modeled is rare, a kind of strategy that isn't just intellectual, but almost spiritual. You didn't just have a plan, you believed in the plan with enough conviction to endure the waiting, the pressure, and the doubt. That's what turned your last stand into a masterclass. It wasn't about predicting the future. It was about creating it through faith strong enough to act like foresight. Number 14. You ended the war without lifting a sword. You didn't win through brute force, noise, or spectacle. You won by making the fight itself irrelevant. While they were sharpening weapons and rallying forces, you were dismantling the conditions that made war possible. You understood that true mastery isn't about conquering an enemy. It's about making the conflict collapse under its own weight until it no longer exists. You didn't have to lift a sword, because by the time they reached for theirs, the field they thought they controlled had already shifted. This is the highest level of power, not the ability to fight well, but the ability to render fighting unnecessary. They were addicted to struggle, expecting you to meet them blow for blow. But you starved the war of oxygen. You took away the narrative, the energy, the justification they needed to keep it alive. Every restraint you practiced, every quiet move you made, every refusal to be provoked, chipped away at the foundation of their aggression until it couldn't stand on its own. By the time they realized it, they weren't fighting you anymore. They were fighting the consequences of their own choices. Their noise had turned into echoes. Their weapons had turned into relics. The silence that followed wasn't peace in the sense of reconciliation. It was the exhaustion of an opponent who had nothing left to swing at. It was surrender camouflaged as wisdom. And that's what made your victory complete. They weren't just defeated. They were transformed into spectators of their own collapse. Most people measure power by what it can destroy. You showed that real power is measured by what it can neutralize. You ended the war not by overpowering them, but by outgrowing the very framework that made them relevant. Without you feeding the cycle, their aggression lost its purpose and its audience. And when the battlefield disappeared, so did their illusion of dominance. This is why your last stand feels different from a typical victory. You didn't just win, you dissolved the fight. You didn't just escape, you erased the need for escape. You proved that sometimes the most devastating strike isn't a blow at all, but the quiet removal of everything that gives conflict life until only silence and truth remain. In the end, your last stand was never about resistance. It was about revelation. Every move, every pause, every act of restraint became part of a language that power itself had forgotten how to read. You didn't fight for victory, you redefined it. You showed that triumph isn't always loud, that control doesn't always come from domination, and that true supremacy is born from self-command, not spectacle. What others called endurance, you turned into instruction. What they saw as isolation, you transformed into doctrine. You didn't just walk through the storm, you rewrote the laws of weather while they were still trying to predict the rain. Your war wasn't fought on the field they prepared. It unfolded in the unseen, in patience, in perception, in the art of letting the opposition overplay their own hand. You made pressure your compass, silence your strategy, and faith your shield. And when the dust settled, there were no bodies, no banners, no speeches, only the undeniable imprint of precision so flawless it became myth. The generals are still studying your composure. The tacticians are still decoding your restraint. You turned a moment of conflict into a curriculum for generations that will never forget your name. What you achieved wasn't just survival, it was evolution. You didn't adapt to the game. You made the game obsolete. You proved that strength, in its purest form, doesn't need validation, vengeance, or witnesses. It simply is. And that's why your legacy isn't written in victories or scars, but in the quiet authority of someone who ended the war without lifting a sword. So, as you walk away from the ashes, not as a survivor but as a strategist who turned chaos into code, remember this: history will keep talking about kings, empires, and conquests, but the scholars will study you. Because your last stand didn't just rewrite the rules, it erased the need for them. If this resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share it with someone who understands what it means to rise without noise and to win without war. Your support helps keep this message alive, and trust me, there's more brilliance coming your way. Stay blessed, always.